Truth in History with Charles A. Jennings.
Welcome to Truth in History. On today's lesson, I'm going to do something a little different. I'd like to give a book report concerning a book that I have had in my library for several years. And it's a controversial subject, but I want to know the truth, and I'm sure that many of you want to know the truth concerning whatever subject there may be. We want to know the truth of the matter. We have heard for years, I'm sure you have too, concerning the Jewish people. And it's always been taught from the pulpit and in the classrooms of seminaries, Bible colleges, that the Jewish people living today, wherever they're at around the world, have an unbroken genealogical line all the way back to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Is that true? We have heard that in order to understand the Bible, and especially Bible prophecy, that you have to understand the Jew or the Jewish people. Also, concerning the Scofield Reference Bible that was printed in 1915 or thereabouts, and it was heavily influenced by the Zionist element of that day, and a man by the name of A.C. Gaebelein, who was a German man, non-Jewish. He helped Scofield put notes in that Bible and get the Bible published. And the whole crux of the Bible prophecy in the notes of that Bible concerns the Jewish people, that they are God's elect, chosen people, descendants of the Israelites of the Old Testament, and they also have a right to the land of promise, that is Canaan land, or now we call Palestine. And the Jews are going to return, and that's a sign of the end time, and it's a sign that the rapture could take place sometime soon. So we, as church people, Bible-believing, church-attending people, have heard this really all of our lives. But I want to know the truth concerning the Jewish people. And I'd like to give a report concerning a book that I have in my library. And I pray that you will be blessed by hearing, statements out of this book as we just skip through this book and try to glean some facts concerning what this system, this prophecy system of futurism and dispensationalism is all about. So, but before we go there, I want to read two verses out of the book of Revelation. Revelation 2:9 says, I know thy works. Now the Lord Jesus is speaking to the church at Smyrna. I know thy works and tribulation and poverty, but thou art rich. And I know the blasphemy of them which say they are Jews, but are not, but are the synagogue of Satan. Revelation 3:9. The Lord is speaking to the church at Philadelphia. Behold, I will make them of the synagogue of Satan, which say they are Jews and are not, but do lie. Behold, I will make them to come and worship before thy feet, and to know that I have loved thee. Apparently, from those two scriptures, we can infer that there were people back in John's day, that is the first century, that purported themselves to be Judahites. But Jesus said, no, you are not Judahites. You are lying concerning your identity. So this is a big subject. It's a long subject. It's a subject that we could go into for basically hours and into different historical backgrounds and so forth. But I just wanted to give you a book report from the Jewish standpoint, because the man who wrote the book that we're going to look at today is of the Jewish faith, and a very learned man at that. But before I go to the book, I'd like to read a couple reviews of the book. Just some remarks concerning two writers that made a review of the book. The name of the book is The Invention of the Jewish People by Shlomo Sand. S-H-L-O-M-O is his first name, and Sand, S-A-N-D, is his last name. So this article, this review is Shlomo Sand, When and How Was the Jewish People Invented? By Jonathan Cook from the Information Clearinghouse via the Truth Seeker, October 17, 2008. He says that this book has been on the bestseller list in Israel, that is the modern state of Israel, for 19 weeks. This is what he said. Dr. Shlomo Sand argues that the idea of a Jewish nation whose need for a safe haven was originally used to justify the founding of the state of Israel is a myth invented little more than a century ago. In addition, he argues that the Jews were never exiled from the Holy Land, that most of today's Jews have no historical connection to the land called Israel, and that the only political solution to the country's conflict with the Palestinians is to abolish the Jewish state. This book has been published in a dozen languages. And he said he predicted a very rough ride from the pro-Israel lobby. So another remark by Mr. Cook. He suggested that Israeli historians were not ignorant about the invented nature of Jewish history. Equally, the modern Zionist idea of Jews being obligated to return from exile to the promised land was entirely alien to Judaism. Another comment. Let's see. It is not taught in Israeli schools, but most of the early Zionist leaders, including David Ben-Gurion, Israel's first prime minister, believed that the Palestinians were the descendants of the area's original Jews. Just thought maybe I'd pass those words on to you in that man's review. Now, here's another review concerning this book. And it is entitled, Is Jewish History Simply Hit and Myth? This was from the Jewish Chronicle, written by David Goldberg, November 26, 2009. I'm just going to skip through this article. It says, this comment written by Mr. Goldberg, quote, "No one today, unless a simpleton, believes that all Jews are descended in an unbroken chain from Abraham to the present." It's quite a statement. "We are a mongrel and widely scattered people. Over the centuries, millions joined Judaism, and a substantial number also left. But no modern historian would take issue with his contention that to call Jews a race or a nation is a misnomer. We are a mongrel and widely scattered people. Neither ethnicity, nor language, culture, nor land link a Jew from the United States with a Jew from Aden. What we do share in common is myth history and a religious heritage, observing the same Sabbath and festivals, performing the same rituals. His particular beef is with geneticists who have discovered such ludicrous, quote, facts as the Jewish gene that is shared by Ashkenazim and Sephardim, or make the even more preposterous claim that a single chromosome is common to over 50% of the men named Cohen. The reason why that statement is so significant is because so many evangelicals today, and some of them on TV, promoting this idea that the Jews are going to build a third temple, and all of these young men named Cohen are of the same genetic line going all the way back to Aaron and Levi. So they are qualified to institute the Levitical order once again. But the name of this book is The Invention of the Jewish People by Shlomo Sand. But I want to make it clear that we do not sell this book. This is the only copy that I have. And we don't know where to buy it. You might check Amazon on the computer. But if you call our ministry, we cannot help you find this book. But I'm sure it's somewhere. It's a popular book. It's been around, so I'm requesting, please don't call our ministry or write our ministry asking for this book, because this is out of my personal library and it was sent to me. So apparently this book was purchased in Great Britain because it sold for 19 pounds. So I just want to give you some remarks out of this book to help us understand the truth of Jewish history. The English edition was published in 2009. I'm going to remove this dust cover. So when we go through this book, it is interesting to know that someone, a professor, let me tell you who Mr. Shlomo Sand is. Shlomo Sand studied history at the University of Tel Aviv and at the, I can't pronounce all these French words, but in Paris. This is what this on the dust cover says. A historical tour de force that demolishes the myths and taboos that have surrounded Jewish and Israeli history. The invention of the Jewish people offers a new account of both that demands to be read and reckoned with. Was there really a forced exile in the first century at the hands of the Romans? Should we regard the Jewish people throughout 2 millennia as both a distinct ethnic group and a putative nation, returned at last to its biblical homeland? That word putative means generally considered or generally accepted. Shlomo Sand argues that most Jews actually descend from converts whose native lands were scattered far across the Middle East and Eastern Europe. The formation of a Jewish people and then a Jewish nation out of these disparate groups could only take place under the sway of a new historiography, developing in response to the rise of nationalism throughout Europe. Beneath the biblical backfill of the 19th century historians and the 20th century intellectuals who replace rabbis as the architects of Jewish identity, the invention of the Jewish people uncovers a new narrative of Israel's formation and proposes a bold analysis of nationalism that accounts for the old myths. So this man is still a professor at the University of Tel Aviv. I'm just going to mainly read different comments throughout the book. What is so amazing is that much of the information cited in this book has always been known inside the limited circles of professional research, but invariably got lost en route to the arena of public and educational memory. So, let me turn the page. And this lesson today is for educational purposes only. Educational purposes only. Another quote, and I'll say that before each time I read a quote. Another quote, dominated by Zionism's particular concept of nationality, the state of Israel still refuses, 60 years after its establishment, to see itself as a republic that serves its citizens. 1/4 of the citizens are not categorized as Jews, and the laws of the state imply that Israel is not their state, nor do they own it. The state has also avoided integrating the local inhabitants into the superstructure it has created and has instead deliberately excluded them. Unquote. We turn to page 68. It says this. Now, he quotes other historians, Jewish historians, and here is Jost, J-O-S-T, and Zunz, Z-U-N-Z. This is what he says. Quote, for Jost, as for Leopold Zun, the second important historian in the early days of the science of Judaism, Jewish history began not with the conversion of Abraham or the tablets of the law on Mount Sinai, but with the return of the exiles from Babylon. It was only then, they argued, that historical religious Judaism began, its culture having been forged by the experience of exile itself, unquote. Another quote, quote, hence it was the period of exile in the broadest sense that ought to represent the start of Jewish history. The breach between ancient Hebraism and Jewish history came to be the underlying concept for most of the German pioneers of the science of Judaism, unquote. I have mentioned this concept many times on our programs, that the Jewish people that we know today start their history post-exilic time. In other words, after the 70 years in Babylon, that's where they started their Jewish history. And this man says the breach between ancient Hebrewism, that is the law of Moses, etc., before the captivity, and Jewish history starting after the captivity. So, very interesting point. Also, on page 74, when Gretz, another historian, quote, when Gretz began publishing his immense Ovir is his works of literature. Let me begin again. Quote, when Gretz began publishing his immense Ovir in 1853, he too, like Basnage and Jost, began the Jewish narrative after the biblical period, and the first volume covered the time of the Mishnah and Talmud after the fall of the temple. So, let me continue that quote. Shortly afterward, he returned to the period of the Hasmonean kingdom, but only 20 years late. And then he mentions about, did Gretz retreat chronologically in order to construct the birth of the, quote, chosen moral people? It was no accident that what was presented as the first national historical epic ever written about the Jews should culminate with the biblical era, unquote. There's so much to read that sometimes it's difficult to know when to stop. Also, tells us this. The popular Jewish, let me begin again. Quote, the popular Christian myth about the wandering Jew, reproduced by rabbinical Judaism in the early centuries of the Common Era, had acquired a historian who began to translate it into pre-national Jewish narrative, unquote. The Common Era is what we would call AD, or Anno Domini, the year of our Lord. And before the Common Era would be before Christ. So we leave that thought concerning the wandering Jew, which I was taught so much in Bible college, to help enhance this chosen people concept. Also tells us this, page 119. Now, what I'm going to read right now is quite revealing, because what he is talking about is that some Jewish historians, even though they trace the history of the Jewish people back into the Old Testament, they do not believe the Old Testament. They do not believe the miracles that took place. They think they were myths. So, quote, "This ruthless myth of settlement, described in the book of Joshua in colorful detail as one of the earliest genocides, never actually happened. The famous conquest of Canaan was the next myth to fall apart in the skirmishes of the new archeology. For a long time, the Zionist historians, followed by the Israeli archaeologists, ignored well-known findings. If at the time of the supposed Israelite conquest, the country was ruled by Egypt, how was it that not a single Egyptian document mentioned this?" Unquote. I have read these statements before, these type of statements, that a lot of the Jewish scholars do not believe in a lot of the miracles or the events that took place that's recorded in our Bible. And they even believe that David and Solomon and their kingdom was nothing but a myth. So instead of reading a whole paragraph, it just simply states that many of the historians writing the history of the Jewish people will trace their history back to the time of the exile, that is, after Babylon, the 70 years in Babylon. And that's where they start their history. But they do not believe in the Old Testament miracles or some of the major events that are mentioned. That includes even David and Solomon. Quote, "The conclusion accepted by a majority of the new archaeologists and Bible scholars was that there never was a great united monarchy and that King Solomon never had grand palaces in which he housed his 700 wives and 300 concubines. unquote. I move on. Page 127. It says, quote, "For many centuries, the Bible has been regarded by the three monotheistic cultures, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, as a divinely inspired work, evidence of God's manifestation and preeminence. With the rise of nationalism in modern times, it began to be seen increasingly as a work composed by human beings as a reconstruction of their past." Unquote. In other words, the Bible that we put so much faith in is just a reconstruction by historians and archaeologists. In other words, it's not true. Also, we go to another quote. Quote, "In this way, the Bible became a secular book that school children read to learn about their ancient forefathers. Children who would later march proudly as soldiers fighting wars of colonization and independence." Unquote. There is a quote by another historian in this book as a footnote, and his name is Israel Jacob Yuval. Quote, "The myth of the exile from the land, Jewish time and Christian time, Adiyah Horon, the intellectual father of the Canaanite movement, said as much long ago, there is no truth in the claim that the exile occurred mainly after the destruction, when Titus and Hadrian supposedly expelled the Jews from Palestine. This idea, based on historical ignorance, derives from a hostile fabrication by the fathers of the Christian church who wanted to show that God punished the Jews for the crucifixion of Jesus." Unquote. Now, you realize that the concept of salvation, personal salvation, is really not found in the tenets of Judaism. As we all know, and as we have all heard, that a lot of the rabbis teach that Isaiah 53, who we believe is referring to Jesus Christ, is really, they teach concerning the Jewish people themselves. They are their own Messiah. That's quite a belief, let me tell you. Let's move on. This is an interesting concept that quote, It seems that the synagogue was born there, and the Babylonian Talmud created there was esteemed more highly than the Jerusalem Talmud because it had emerged from a more elevated cultural context, unquote. What is also believed, and is the professor is pointing out, that the Babylonian Talmud and the concept of the synagogue was created or come about during that post-exilic period of time after the Babylonian captivity. So the Talmud is not a sacred book to Christians. It shouldn't be, because it is not divinely inspired. It was written by scribes and learned men and rabbis of the time. Also, we read concerning this. Quote, given its great scale, the expansion of Judaism in the ancient world cannot be accounted for by natural increase, by migration from the homeland, or any other explanation that does not include outsiders joining in, unquote. In other words, proselytes, people that joined Judaism, people that joined the Jewish people, accepted their customs, their history, their dress, their food, etc. And they became known as Jews. And then their descendants were born, and their descendants, etc., were known as Jews, but really had no connection whatsoever with Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob. Now, that's what this book is telling us. That's what this Jewish professor is trying to inform us about. So we go to page 156, talking about John Hyrcanus. Quote, Zionist historians have sought to play down the uncomfortable fact that after Mattathias, the priest expelled the Hellenized leadership from Jerusalem and restored the ancient glory, his grandson, who because of his descent became the ruler, added to his Hebrew name Johann or Yohanan, the typical Greek name Hyrcanus. The great-grandson of the rebel priest was called Judas Aristobulus, and his son would be known as Alexander Jannaeus. By the time of Aristobulus, priestly ruler, though not of the house of David, had become a Hellenistic monarch. Were they really, unquote, were these priests really of the Davidic line? These priests that I just read about lived in that 400-year period between Malachi and Matthew. And Mr. Sand tells us they were not of the house of David. Quote, the Hasmoneans did not claim descent from the house of David, and they saw no reason to emulate the story of Joshua, the mythological conqueror of Canaan. In 125 BCE, Yohanan Hyrcanus conquered Edom, the country that spread south of Bethzur and En Gedi as far as Beersheba, and Judaized its inhabitants by force, unquote. And then he quotes Josephus in his Antiquities of the Jews. And this is a quote from Josephus. Quote, Hyrcanus took also Dora and Marissa, cities of Idumea, and subdued all the Idumeans, and permitted them to stay in that country, if they would circumcise their genitals and make use of the laws of the Jews. And they were so desirous of living in the country of their forefathers that they submitted to the use of circumcision and of the rest of the Jewish ways of living, at which time, therefore, this befell them, that they were hereafter no other than Jews, unquote. In other words, these were Edomites. Idumeans is another name for Edomites. So the Edomites of Edom became Jews when John Hyrcanus conquered them. And history tells us that Herod was an Edomite. So we go to the next page. Quote, thus did the ruling Hasmonean high priest annex an entire people, not only to his kingdom, but also to his Jewish religion. Henceforth, the Edomite people would be seen as an integral part of the Jewish people, unquote. Quote, who were the Edomites? There are several sources. The important Greek geographer Strabo, who lived at the time of Augustus, erroneously stated, the Idumeans are Nabateans. When driven from their country by sedition, they passed over to the Jews and adopted their customs. The Idumeans, on the other hand, were not originally Jews, but Phoenicians and Syrians, having been subjugated by the Jews and having been forced to undergo circumcision, so as to be counted among the Jewish nation and to keep the same customs. They were called Jews, unquote. Well, there you have it. Another quote, the crushing of the Zealot revolt in Judea in the years 66 to 70 CE did not stop the widespread wave of proselyting that had begun with the Maccabees uprising 2 centuries earlier, unquote. Proselyting is gaining other people to your religion or way of life. So, we go to page 188. Well, there is so much to review. that it's difficult to know where to start and where to stop. Another quote. This national statement, which was simplified into a useful and popular slogan for the Zionist movement, was entirely the product of an imaginary history grown around the idea of the exile. Although most of the professional historians knew there had never been a forcible uprooting of the Jewish people, they permitted the Christian myth that had been taken up by Jewish tradition to be paraded freely in the public and educational venues of the national memory, making no attempt to rebut it. They even encouraged it indirectly, knowing that only this myth would provide moral legitimacy to the settlement of the, quote, exiled nation, unquote, in a country inhabited by others, unquote. What does this statement mean? The Jewish historians knew better, but they did not rebut, did not deny this myth, this wrong history of this forced exile by the Romans after 70 AD, and therefore the Jews, or quote, Israelites, were spread around the world, and it became a Christian myth. And the Jewish rabbis and the leaders of the Zionist nation saw that this would be to their advantage because of the ignorance of Christians, believing that the Jews were exiled out of Jerusalem and Judea after the destruction by Rome of the temple in 70 AD. And that's what we have seen and heard on television for the last 40 years with these big ministries perpetuating this Christian myth of an exiled holy people, chosen people. And therefore they have collected money, they have produced books and seminars and tapes and programs promoting this Christian myth because it's to the advantage of these ministries raising money and also supporting the state of Israel. And there's a whole movement called something about Christians and Jews, for the support of Christians and Jews, and they hold big rallies, all based upon a myth, believing that the Jewish people have an unbroken genealogical history all the way back to Abraham, which is not true. So we come to another quote on page 189. Quote, had the memory of the mass conversion to Judaism been preserved, it might have eroded the meta-narrative about the biological unity of the Jewish people, whose genealogical roots were believed to trace back all the way to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, not to a heterogeneous mosaic of human populations that lived in the Hasmonean kingdom, in the Persian domain, and in the far-flung expanse of the Roman Empire. Unquote. That is telling us that if the true history of this proselyting of other people to join Judaism, if it had been known that these people were not true Judahites, the myth would have dissipated. We would not be living with that myth today. But historians, both Jewish and Christian, have perpetuated the lie that these people known as Jews have an unbroken, pure lineage all the way back to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And they are of pure lineage, but yet the truth tells us they are part Edomite, according to Professor Sand. Another quote, "Forgetting the forced Judaization and the great voluntary proselytization was essential for the preservation of a linear timeline, along with back and forth from past to present and back again, moved a unique nation, wandering, isolated, and of course, quite imaginary," unquote. These are strong statements. Here is a quote by another Jewish historian by the name of Isaac Asimov from his book, It's Been a Good Life. Quote, "It is even possible that my ancestry might not move in the direction of ancient Israel at all. After 965, the Khazars were through as an organized power, but Judaism may have remained, and it may well be that many Eastern European Jews are descended from Khazars and the people they ruled. I may be one of them. Who knows and who cares?" Unquote. Another quote, "In reality, before Judaism turned inward, chiefly due to the exclusionary walls built around it by Christianity, it continued its efforts at proselytization in the still virgin lands that had yet to experience the spread of monotheism," unquote. These professors are telling us that the Jewish people are not a pure genetic line going back to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but yet why do these Christians, these preachers on television, constantly tell us and promote this lie? I think the Lord is going to hold them responsible. What we are dealing with in Christianity today are two things: ignorance, which is the lack of knowledge, and rebellion, which is the rejection of knowledge. So we go to page 202. This Professor Sand is actually telling us that possibly some of the Berbers practiced Judaism, which they had received from their powerful neighbors. The Berbers, if you know who they were. Also, he tells us in let's see. This professor quotes another professor talking about the non-Jewish origins of the Sephardic Jews. And Professor Sand makes the statement, the Khazars, just before their mass conversion to Judaism, outdid Kahina and her Berber Jewish troops in halting the advance of Islam. Judaized Berbers and Judaized Arabs who accompanied the armies of Islam. I won't read a whole lot there, but on page 210, there's a subtitle called Jewish Khazar. A strange empire rises in the east. And it talks about the Khazars, Khazars. And he quotes part of a letter composed by Menahem ben Serug, Hashdai's secretary and the leading Hebrew poet in the Iberian Peninsula. And he talks about the conversion of the Khazar people to Judaism. And there's another quote that I will read on page 211, which says, I quote, "It is not known how long it took before the Khazar's king's reply arrived, his reply to a letter. But in the extant letter, King Joseph answered Hasdai's questions as best as he could. He described his origin and the boundaries of his kingdom. Inside quote, "You have asked of what nation and family and tribe we are. Know you that we are of the sons of Japheth and of his son Togarmah." Unquote. He did not say he was of Shem. So the King Joseph of the Khazar kingdom said that he and his family and tribe were of the sons of Japheth. Unquote. Or quote. This is what Professor Sand says, quote, "Writing in an epic and ornate style, the king describes the conversion to Judaism and lists the reasons that moved his ancestors to prefer the Jewish religion to the other two monotheistic faiths," unquote. In other words, this whole section of this chapter is dealing with the conversion of the Khazar kingdom to Judaism. And these people began to, after the Khazar kingdom broke up, they began to migrate into Southern Europe, Hungary, Yugoslavia, on up to Russia. And apparently they established or were instrumental in building up the city of Kiev. And what is now Ukraine, where the war is taking place. So there may be more to that war than what we realize. But going to page 235, it says that, quote, there had been Jewish settlements in the country before the Khazar's conversion, even before the Khazar conquest, talking about different areas of that part of the world. And then there was a blackout, that is, historians just ignoring this part of their history. Let me give you another quote. What caused this silent lapse in the Jewish-Israeli memory? Aside from the traditional ethnocentric conception that in some form dominates every aspect of Jewish nationalism, there are two possible hypotheses. One is that the wave of decolonization of the 1950s and 60s drove the Israeli memory merchants to avoid the very shadow of the Khazar past. There was anxiety about the legitimacy of the Zionist project. Should it become widely known that the settling Jewish masses were not the direct descendants of the children of Israel, such delegitimization might lead to a broad challenge against the state of Israel's right to exist. Unquote. That's a powerful statement. So the historians on both sides of the aisle, Jewish and Christian, promoted this concept, really this lie. It's deception. Absolute horrible deception. So the whole Christian world right now, except those people that want to learn the truth, is under the canopy of a real big hoax and have spent and donated millions, possibly billions of dollars to a people who claim they are the children of Israel when really they are not. So now we see what Jesus meant in Revelation 2:9-3:9 when he said, they do lie. But now we have to include Christian theologians, Christian pastors, prominent ones. You can see them on television all day long, promoting this grand scheme, hoax, and have milked the American Christian people out of millions of dollars. Well, let's move on. Pages 238 and 239, he quotes from two other Jewish sources. He said in 1976, Arthur Koestler dropped a literary bombshell entitled The 13th Tribe. And this is his book. And he was talking about the Khazars and the conversion of those Khazars to Judaism. And then Professor Sand refers to another book by Kevin A. Brooke entitled The Jews of Khazar. And here it is. These are my personal copies of this book. And I've read both of these books. Gives good, strong evidence. Now keep in mind that these are Jewish writers, Jewish historians. This is not coming from a anti-Jewish perspective. It's coming from a historical Jewish perspective. And here is another book that Professor Sand does not refer to, but it has a very interesting title, and it's written by Arthur A. Cohen, and it's entitled The Myth of the Judeo-Christian Tradition. The myth. It is a myth. Even Dr. Gary North said there is no such thing as a Judeo-Christian tradition. He said, if it exists, where's it at? So I thought maybe I would point that out because these books supplement the book that we are reading from today. So these are powerful words. These can be very disturbing words because it's going against the grain of the myth, the mendacity, the deception that is purported to be gospel truth. Here's another quote. Page 246. Khazar collapsed sometime before the first indications of the presence of Jews in Eastern Europe. And it is difficult not to connect the two. Although Jewish believers in Russia, Ukraine, Poland, Lithuania, Hungary erased their Khazar or Slavic past from memory and remembered instead, like the descendants of Himyars and North Africa's Judaizers, how they, quote, came out of Egypt's house of bondage, unquote. Various vestiges of their true historical past did remain, unquote. That is the Christian myth that these Jews, Khazarian Jews, came out of Egypt's house of bondage. Jews didn't come out of Egypt. Israelites came out of Egypt. And those are two different people. So we go to page 251. The writer is talking about identity politics in Israel. And he talks about Theodor Herzl, who was the father of the Zionist movement, who was instrumental with other men, in establishing and holding the first Zionist conference in Basel, Switzerland in 1897. So it's a big subject, but Theodor Herzl, he says the true founder of the Zionist movement, or let me just read it. Quote, Theodor Herzl, the true founder of the Zionist movement, was less certain and could not decide if the Jews arose from a homogeneous source. His writings include some comments that reflect a clear ethnocentric outlook and others that contradict it. The term race occurs several times in the Jewish state, but it is used in the manner of the period as another word for people, sans biological connotations. One evening in London, Herzl dined with the Anglo-Jewish author Israel Zangwill, who would later join the Zionist movement. In his personal diary that day, the handsome leader expressed dismay that the writer, who was famously ugly, thought that they shared the same origin. Then he quotes from Zangwill, he obsesses about the racial aspect, which I cannot accept. It's enough for me to look at myself and at him. I say only this. We are a historical entity, a nation made up of different anthropological elements. That will suffice for the Jewish state. Unquote. Israel Zangwill, I think he's the man that wrote the quote that is at the base of the Statue of Liberty. He says they came from a nation made up of different anthropological elements. So it's quite revealing and can be somewhat disturbing to some people, and no doubt some will take issue with me in what I am saying today. And no doubt label me whatever nasty label they want to pin on me. But I wanted to share this information, this knowledge, written by Shlomo Sand, a professor in Tel Aviv University, from his standpoint. And if anyone is interested in this book, please look on Amazon or somewhere, because we do not sell this book. We don't give away this book. I only have one copy, and someone sent it to me because apparently they wanted me to have this information, this evidence. So folks, we must be philologists. Now, what does that mean? It means the love of knowledge and understanding. In all thy getting, get understanding. People can have a lot of knowledge, but what about understanding? And we must have this Bible that I hold in my hand and that you have in your hand as the final word, as the final word, law of faith, belief, and practice. This book right here, extolling Jesus Christ as the Messiah of Israel. Jesus never called himself the King of the Jews. Pilate did that because Jesus knew the difference in the crowd that he was speaking to. Even John the Baptist knew when he said, when certain of the Pharisees came to him, he said, O ye generation of vipers, who hath warned you to flee from the wrath to come? So apparently John the Baptist knew that there were rabbis, doctors of the law, Pharisees, scribes, Sadducees, that were not Israelites, were not true Judahites. And Jesus also stated it, the very words of John the Baptist, and then in Revelation 2:9 and 3:9, it settled it. Folks, we want to believe the truth. We want to believe true history and not buy in to tradition and Christian myths that are being purported in pulpits, in Bible colleges, seminaries, over these television networks. They are lying to the American people. So God help us to know the truth, because the truth is only going to set us free when we know it. Ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. We shall only know it. We shall only be set free when we know the truth. And the Bible tells us, my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge, lack of understanding. So thank you, Lord Jesus, for opening our eyes, bringing this information our way so that we can know the truth instead of accepting the lies of tradition. God bless you.